I'm a big proponent of the idea that you should only buy what you need. Overspending on tech products is a good way to ensure you waste your hard-earned money and can also result in substantially more e-waste than most people have a concept of how to handle. Now that's not to say you should never upgrade your devices, just that you should do it deliberately and only invest in the devices you will actually use. I'm also a massive hypocrite and I have bins of currently unused hardware just sitting around my house. This is one of those do as I say, not as I do kind of things, if I'm honest. So when I found myself in need of a new mobile typing device just a few months ago due to the failure of a keyboard that really shouldn't have failed, but hey, let's not point fingers, Apple. Instead of repurposing one of my old laptops, I launched into a search for something budget-oriented but new that would fit the bill. It was about that time that Landon over on the Calling All Platforms podcast, which you should totally check out on the podcasting platform of your choice, introduced me to a subsection of the Linux universe that I had somehow missed by bringing up the PinePhone. That device is an open-designed smartphone that runs Linux distributions, and is actually very interesting, I swear. We'll get to videos on that front in the future, but that's a side note to our current story. When I went to look into the PinePhone myself, I discovered that the makers of the phone, Pine64, have got a lot more hardware than just that phone for sale. Of particular interest to me, a writer who sometimes would rather sit on the couch than at his desk because, let's face it, I never leave the house, were the laptops, the Pinebook and Pinebook Pro. Because even in the world of open source and a free digital existence, people can't help but pay homage to Apple for some reason. So, here we are. Now I went over some of the physical design points of the Pinebook Pro when I unboxed it, and you can find that quick look in the description below or the card above. But let's start by going into a bit more detail concerning the hardware itself. Let's start with the screen, because I didn't turn the thing on during my unboxing video and wasn't really able to touch on that. It's a 1080p IPS panel, and lacking anything even approaching a factory calibration, I can't really say what sort of color coverage it's supposed to be capable of. But forget that, given a peak brightness of just around 200 nits, it's actually too dim to do any real color-sensitive work anyway. That said, it's nice and sharp, and 1080p is a perfectly adequate resolution for a screen this size. The bezels around the edges are even relatively narrow, meaning it doesn't look freakishly dated right out of the box in 2020. The keyboard and trackpad don't look like anything particularly special at first, and, well, I can confirm that they're not really anything particularly special. That said, the keyboard does have a solid amount of travel for a laptop, and a really solid tactile feel when you actuate the keys. There's more resistance than I personally prefer, which can cause fatigue in extended typing sessions, but for bursts of typing I find the keyboard to be pleasant enough. Key stabilization is generally pretty solid, the chances of accidental inputs are very low, and the keys themselves are still low profile enough for me to hit my peak burst speeds. The trackpad, on the other hand, has issues. Pointing accuracy is generally very low and response is sluggish, but I suspect that's actually an issue with the hardware drivers included in Manjaro currently. I haven't loaded any other distros to test that, but the thing I want to complain about is an extremely noisy click that only actuates on about the bottom half of the trackpad, and a plastic finish that overall feels extremely cheap. Of course, the machine was, in fact, extremely cheap. The built-in webcam and microphones are, broadly speaking, adequate. They're nothing special, but I've been living with the built-in webcam and mic on a 9-year-old MacBook for most of the past 9 years, so in comparison, they're perfectly average. Suffice it to say, you'd probably be better off using your phone for Zoom calls if you can, especially since you're limited to browser Zoom only in these parts. Bizarrely, Zoom doesn't seem to have any intent of releasing an ARM Linux version of their client. Weird. That is, of course, unless you have a phone that also costs $200, in which case the Pinebook Pro will at least work. Speaking of budget phones, don't forget to hit subscribe so you don't miss my upcoming PinePhone review, because that's obviously coming. Now, the speakers, in contrast, are anything but adequate. They're harsh, tinny, hilariously quiet despite that, and have the bass response of a Weevil. The included DAC, or digital to analog converter for the uninitiated, that drives the headphone jack output isn't wonderful, but for the love of all that is holy, if you mean to listen to music on this thing, use headphones. Now, the internals, a matter on which I owe you an apology. The 6-core CPU I mentioned in my unboxing was identified that way as a deliberate misdirect. Yes, the thing has 6 processing cores, but it's ARM-based. Specifically, it's an ARM-designed Rockchip RK3399 SoC with a Mali T860 integrated graphics processor. That's a 64-bit big little design with 2 performance cores and 4 efficiency cores, a clock speed that looks at the 2 GHz barrier with envy most of the time, and generally speaking feels more at home in specialized embedded devices and lower-end smartphones most of the time. Now, I do in fact have a few other devices with 6-core CPUs to compare this to. My Mac Mini runs an Intel i7-8700B, my gaming rig is powered by an AMD Ryzen 5 2600, and in probably the most appropriate lane, the A12 Bionic in my iPhone is also a 6-core ARM CPU. And I would love to give you head-to-head performance benchmarks between all of these chips, But given that one is running Windows, one is running Mac OS, one is an iPhone, and the one we actually care about is running a freaking ARM build of Manjaro, that's a little more difficult than you might think. I wound up settling on a browser-based benchmark that hates my Ryzen system for some reason. It initiated all 12 threads on that system and then chugged like a beast. And even though the 8700B is hyper-threaded, it only initiated one thread per core. Of course, it then proceeded to dominate the Ryzen system, when more reliable benchmarking utilities like Cinebench have demonstrated that the two chips actually perform pretty similarly, or they would if the Mac Mini weren't such an oven. The point is, though, that this benchmark only utilized about half the actual processing performance of the 8700B, while it absolutely slammed the Rockchip RK3399 on the Pinebook Pro. And even still, the results were telling. Suffice it to say, the Pinebook Pro is not running a desktop-class CPU. In a more appropriate head-to-head with another mobile chip, the test actually only initialized a single core for the A12, which I'm beginning to suspect is a Safari issue. But even with only one thread utilized, the RK3399 still lags behind. So you're probably wondering right about now what the actual experience is like with this machine. Well, like any other computer you can get in this price range, that's going to depend entirely on your use case. If you want to game on it, it's an ARM-based Linux laptop. I'm not sure what to tell you other than just no. Like, obviously not. If you want to do video editing or audio production, that's a little more complicated. There are plenty of open source tools out there for you that have ARM versions available for Linux, and they do work. But I'd say your experience is probably not going to be really any better than trying to edit video or audio on any other $200 laptop using those same tools. Though the Linux support of open source software does tend to be better than Windows support, so you may benefit from some software optimization on the Pinebook that you wouldn't get anywhere else. And what if you're just looking for an internet consumption device? Well, the Pinebook Pro works for that, but as I said, the speakers are hot garbage, and even if the screen is plenty sharp, it's dim. And on top of that, the CPU really struggles, at least in the current build of Manjaro, to play back some high-resolution video codecs. So yeah, the Pinebook Pro can do all those things, aside from gaming, to some extent, but not necessarily better than any other $200 laptop. But here's the kicker. That ARM processor, it is genuinely 6 cores. Sure, they're anemic underpowered cores, but there's still 6 of them, running 6 discrete threads, which means that for lightweight but preferentially multi-threaded workloads, this thing destroys anything else in its price class. And yeah, there aren't very many single workloads that like lots of cores but don't mind if they're actually fast. So in practice, what this means is that the Pinebook Pro multitasks like a beast compared to other cheap laptops. Because with Intel or even AMD, if you're getting a $200 laptop, you're running something like a base-level Celeron that's a year or two old. So while single-thread performance might be better than the Rockchip RK3399, there's only going to be 2 of them. For office workloads or even some programming workloads, as long as you're not compiling your code constantly, this is a great cheap mobile device. And while sure, your individual pieces of software, like your spreadsheet stuff or whatever, is that what professionals do, spreadsheets, will feel slower when they're the only thing running, once you've got 4 or 5 pieces of software open, the Pinebook finally makes its case. For me, this works out just about perfectly. I can have a working document open with another reference document behind it, a browser window with a handful of research tabs to reference, music playing in the background, and a couple of PDFs if I need to look at some older content, and none of those programs have to stutter to a start after some thread switching when I call for them. I have tried this on cheap Windows laptops many times in the past, and it drags them to their knees. On top of that, I'm an Apple customer, which means I value physical fit and finish more than the majority of, let's face it, normal people. So the fact that I can get a brand new laptop for $200 that has a decent screen, a good keyboard, and a metal exterior absolutely blows my mind. And on top of that, the thing is fanless because it's basically running a smartphone chip. The bottom never really gets hot to the touch, and it's completely silent under load. Also, the battery lasts about 15 hours if you're mainly doing web browsing and writing, which, that's neat. So if your workload involves a lot of text and a lot of research on the go, this laptop is brilliant. And that's not even considering the fact that the hardware is an open design. That means crowdsourced security, that means deeper levels of control, and that means you can use your device without a single subscription service. I'm not a Linux guru by any stretch of the imagination, but I do appreciate the surface-level benefits the open source community nets me, and Manjaro has been overall very friendly to use. I don't have complicated needs, and my experience with the platform has been very nice. I will absolutely be trying out some other distros in the future, but Manjaro hasn't given me any reason to switch yet. Oh, except for the fact that the thing can't sleep. If you don't want the battery to drain when you put it down at the same rate as it does when it's awake, you have to shut the laptop off. Which is annoying, but weirdly not a deal breaker, given that because the entire thing is solid state, And because Linux distros don't typically have much startup bloat, it actually starts cold faster than a laptop equipped with a hard drive would wake from sleep. So no, it's not a perfect laptop, but for $200, I'm seriously very impressed.